I remember standing there in the doorway, two battered suitcases at my feet, moving truck grumbling in the driveway, when my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, pointed toward a narrow staircase and told me with a tight, smug little smile, "The basement will be good enough for you." I didn't argue. That choice, just swallowing it, watching the words pass by like a train I had no intention of catching, shaped everything that happened afterward. And the reasons for my silence? Not as simple as exhaustion or good manners. My son Dean's house. My name is Patricia Calloway. I'm 68. 8 months earlier, my husband Walter died. One of those cruelly ordinary mornings. No warning, no long illness. Just a bright Tuesday and toast for breakfast. By lunchtime, I was a widow. If you've lost someone, you probably know that grief isn't tidy or orderly. Some days you think you're fine, and then you're not. I was in one of those not fine waves when Dean suggested I move in with him and Vanessa. "Just until you figure out what's next," he said gently, like I was a stray cat he'd found at the back door. I said yes, and let's be real about why. Sure, part of it was heartbreak, being unable to imagine rattling around in a big old house with Walter's scent still hanging in the air, his reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand where he'd left them, his side of the closet still full because I hadn't been able to make myself empty it. But part of it was curiosity, maybe even nosiness. How did Dean and Vanessa actually live? What did their marriage look like up close? In 11 years, Vanessa had managed to keep things polite, always just distant enough so I felt out of reach, never quite close enough to know her, never quite far enough to ignore the gap. I think, looking back, I'd spent over a decade telling myself that distance was just her personality, something to do with being a slightly reserved person who took her time warming up to people. I'm less sure now that this explanation was ever entirely accurate. Some distances are personality. Some distances are simply preference, dressed up to look like shyness so nobody has to call it what it actually is. Walter used to say, gently, every now and then, that I read too much into Vanessa's quietness, that some people just aren't talkers, that it didn't necessarily mean anything about how she felt about either of us. I believed him, mostly, for years, because Walter was usually right about people, a careful, patient observer his whole life. I wonder sometimes now whether he'd have read it the same way after watching what happened in that basement. I'll never know. That's one of the strange, small griefs of losing someone you talked everything through with for 41 years. You lose the version of every future conversation you'd have had with them too. Let me tell you something important. They wouldn't have that house at all, if not for Walter and me. We helped them with a big chunk of the down payment, not a gift, not exactly. Walter was practical about money his whole life, the kind of man who read every line of every contract twice before signing anything. Even contracts that had nothing to do with money at all, insurance policies, warranty agreements, the fine print on a new washing machine. Our lawyer drew up paperwork, a private lien against the house, through our family trust. It wasn't about mistrust, just protection, just in case, the kind of careful structuring Walter insisted on for everything important in our lives. The same instinct that had us paying off our own mortgage early and keeping a meticulous filing system, labeled folders in a metal cabinet in his study, for every piece of paperwork we'd ever signed in 41 years of marriage. Dean knew exactly what he was signing. He sat across from our attorney's desk 11 years ago, nodding along, asking a couple of clarifying questions, the way you'd expect a reasonably responsible adult to behave when his parents are helping him buy a house. Vanessa was there too, but honestly, I watched her glaze over, her kind of quiet, detached consent, the way people sign what they're told to sign and then barely remember it later. The same glazed look I'd seen on plenty of young brides and grooms signing things their families had already decided needed signing. Over the years, Vanessa stopped talking about that lien altogether. The house simply became theirs, and Walter and my help drifted into some hazy category of in-law niceness in her mind, the kind of thing you mention vaguely at a dinner party if it ever comes up. His parents helped us out a bit when we bought the place, without ever once specifying exactly how much or under what terms or what that help actually still meant on paper. But that lien, still very real, still sitting quietly in a stack of legal documents, ready to matter the moment things got complicated. The way important paperwork always does, patient and indifferent to whether anyone remembers it exists. I arrived one gray Saturday afternoon, just the essentials with me, most of the rest of 41 years of accumulated furniture and belongings already sold off or donated, or sitting in a storage unit I hadn't yet decided what to do with. There's a particular grief in watching strangers carry your dining room table out to a truck. The table where you raised your son, where you sat across from your husband 11,000 ordinary dinners, reduced to a line item on somebody else's estate sale inventory. I'd cried over smaller things that week than I expected to. A chipped mug, a coat that still smelled faintly like Walter's cologne, and I arrived at Dean's house that afternoon, already a little hollowed out before anything else had even happened yet. Dean and Vanessa helped carry things in, and then, with one quick gesture and that little smirk, Vanessa pointed me to the basement. "It's good enough," she said. Dean looked uncomfortable but stayed silent, his eyes flicking toward me and then away, the specific, familiar look of a grown man who knows something unfair just happened and has already decided, in that exact second, not to be the one who says so out loud. I knew right then whose idea the basement had been, and I knew just as clearly that Dean wasn't going to be the one to undo it. And still, I didn't argue. Not because I'm a saint or too broken down to fight, though I was exhausted, honestly, the kind of exhausted that settles deep into your bones after 8 months of grief and 100 small administrative tasks. Nobody warned you come, with losing a spouse, the bank accounts, the insurance paperwork, the slow, grinding business of unwinding a life you'd built with someone for 4 decades. But I didn't argue, partly because I knew how much I didn't want to start this new chapter with a battle over where I'd sleep on my very first afternoon in a house I was going to be living in for who knew how long. Plus, and I admit this was a little petty, sitting there underneath the practical reasoning, I knew something Vanessa didn't. That house wasn't quite as much theirs as she thought, and some small, tired, quietly stubborn part of me almost enjoyed knowing that, even as I carried my own suitcase down those basement stairs without a word of complaint. That first week, I told myself it was no big deal. I'd cope. The basement was musty, full of junk, old Christmas decorations stacked in plastic bins along one wall, a treadmill shoved into the corner that I never once saw either of them use, a strip of window high up near the ceiling, letting in only the faintest gray light most afternoons. The kind of room that technically counts as livable space, but was clearly never designed with an actual person's comfort in mind. I bought a small space heater that first week because the basement ran noticeably colder than the rest of the house, and I never once mentioned that to either of them either, just quietly solved it myself the way I'd quietly solved most small discomforts in my life, a habit I'm not sure, looking back, served me especially well. But I let it go. I told myself it was temporary, an adjustment period, the natural awkwardness of a household figuring out how to absorb a new person. I kept thinking someone would remember I'm a guest in more than name, that the basement assignment had simply been a first, slightly thoughtless decision rather than the actual, permanent shape of things to come. That never happened, not in any meaningful way, not for months. Boxes kept piling up around me. Not all at once, nothing dramatic, just a slow, steady accumulation. The kind that happens when a space stops being considered fully occupied by a person and starts being treated quietly as overflow storage with a bed pushed into the corner of it. No one ever asked if it was okay to stack things 3 feet from my dresser. Nobody apologized when I'd come downstairs some evening to find a new box of old winter coats or seasonal decorations, sitting exactly where I'd have to step around it to reach my own closet. It became, over weeks, just the unremarked texture of how that basement functioned, and I'll admit, There were nights I lay there in the dim light from that single high window and felt something harden in my chest that I didn't entirely recognize as anger yet. Not consciously, just a low, persistent discomfort I kept telling myself wasn't worth naming. I started keeping a small, almost involuntary mental tally during those months, not because I planned to use it for anything, just because some part of me needed somewhere to put the accumulating small slights so they didn't simply disappear into the general fog of grief I was already moving through. The week nobody told me about my granddaughter's school recital until the morning of, because apparently informing me hadn't crossed anyone's mind. The holiday dinner where I was seated, almost as an afterthought, at the far end of the table near the kitchen door, while Vanessa's parents, visiting from out of state, sat in the places of honor. None of it was dramatic on its own. All of it added up the way small things do into something considerably heavier than any single instance of it would suggest. Vanessa told a friend on the phone once, her voice carrying right through the basement bathroom door while I stood there folding laundry, that they were being so generous by letting me stay at all. Like this was some massive sacrifice, like she was doing me a kindness, handing over a half-finished basement storage room as though it were an act of remarkable charity rather than the only decision she'd ever actually made about my living situation 8 months earlier in about 90 seconds. Without consulting anyone. I stood there with a clean towel in my hands and felt myself harden just a little more, the specific, quiet sting of hearing your own circumstances narrated back to you as evidence of somebody else's selflessness. I didn't say anything that day either. I want to be honest that there were plenty of moments, scattered across those months, where I could have said something, could have brought up the basement directly, asked plainly whether there was a better arrangement available, and I genuinely don't have a clean, satisfying answer for why I kept choosing silence instead, beyond the simple, ongoing fatigue of being recently widowed in someone else's house, where every confrontation, however small, felt like it cost more energy than I actually had available most days. Everything changed the night I came upstairs for water and found Dean and Vanessa hunched over a table covered in bills, the specific, hushed posture of two people working through a problem they hadn't fully solved yet. Dean's business had been struggling for months actually, a couple of major contracts falling through in the same stretch, the kind of bad luck that compounds itself the longer it goes on. I hadn't meant to overhear what came next, hovering in the hallway a few seconds longer than I should have, but once I caught the thread of what they were actually discussing, I found I couldn't make myself walk away from it either. Vanessa asked, almost offhand, the way you'd ask about a minor scheduling detail rather than a substantial legal obligation. What about your parents' old loan? Can't we just have it wiped out or rolled in with the refinance? It's just a formality at this point, right? And I stood there in the hallway, suddenly wide awake in a way I hadn't been in months. It wasn't a formality. That lien was hundreds of thousands of dollars, recorded against the title of the exact house I was currently living inside the basement of, and it was still very much alive, still requiring my actual signature as trustee before any bank would let a single thing move forward with their refinance. I needed to sign off before anything happened, and Vanessa, 11 years removed from the actual paperwork, apparently had no real understanding that this was true at all. I didn't decide what to do that night. I just went back downstairs and sat on my bed for a long while, letting the whole absurdity of the situation sink in slowly, the specific irony of being asked, in the room directly above the one I'd been quietly tolerating for months, to simply make several $100,000 of legitimate, documented financial standing disappear because remembering it had become inconvenient. I thought about Walter that night more than I had in weeks, wondered what he'd have said, sitting there in that basement, if he could have seen exactly how that careful, deliberate paperwork of his had ended up mattering. Decades later, in a way neither of us could have predicted, when he sat across from our attorney insisting on doing things properly. The bank, as it happened, found the paperwork before any of us had to say a single word about it ourselves. Their refinance application stalled almost immediately once an underwriter pulled the full title history on the property and found, exactly where Walter's careful planning had placed it 11 years earlier, an active second lien requiring explicit release or subordination before anything new could be processed. Dean came to me a few days later, genuinely confused, asking about this old trust thing the bank kept referencing on the phone, clearly having no real memory himself of the specifics, just a vague sense that something with his parents' names on it was now standing in the way of a financial solution he badly needed. So I sat them both down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd overheard their conversation from, and laid it all out plainly. The terms, the legal reality. The fact that, for 11 years, Vanessa had ignored a piece of the truth because it was more comfortable that way, easier to simply assume the house was fully and uncomplicatedly theirs than to hold on to the actual, specific shape of an arrangement that came with real, ongoing obligations attached. The look on her face, confused, then embarrassed, then something close to angry at herself rather than at me, was its own quiet, complicated kind of satisfaction, though I want to be honest that it didn't feel triumphant the way you might expect. It mostly just felt sad, watching someone realize, in real time, exactly how much they'd built an entire understanding of their own life, on top of a misunderstanding they'd never once bothered to check. "So you could just say no," she said, her voice a little unsure for the first time since I'd known her, none of the earlier smugness left in it at all. "You could refuse to sign." I said I could. I wanted her to feel that, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how easy it is to overlook or dismiss people who hold more standing than you've ever bothered to consider. "But I'm not going to hold your finances hostage. That isn't who I am. But since we're finally being honest, there's a few other things I'd like us to be honest about too." I told them what those things were: the basement, the boxes, the phone call I'd overheard through the bathroom door, the one where my situation had gotten quietly rewritten into evidence of somebody else's generosity, the recital nobody told me about until the morning of, the holiday table. I didn't ask for anything specific in that moment, no demands, no conditions attached to my signature. I just wanted it said, out loud, in the same room where the rest of the truth was finally getting said too, because it felt, sitting there like exactly the right evening, for all of it to finally come out at once, rather than getting buried again under another round of polite, comfortable vagueness. Vanessa didn't change overnight, and nobody hugged it out, and I think it's important to say that plainly, rather than pretend the story wrapped up neatly the moment the truth came out. The days that followed were awkward, sure. We circled each other like cats in a new house, both of us recalibrating, both of us a little unsure what an honest version of this relationship was even supposed to look like after 11 years of a considerably less honest one. There were dinners where the conversation felt stilted, careful, everyone choosing their words with more deliberation than usual, the particular discomfort of a household working through something real, instead of simply pretending it had never happened. But things shifted, gradually, and the shifting was real, even if it wasn't dramatic. The treadmill and boxes disappeared within the week, hauled out to a storage unit of their own, without my having to ask twice. Vanessa offered me a choice, genuinely this time, stay in the newly cleared, more livable basement if I actually preferred it, or move into the guest room upstairs, a room with sun, an actual window that let in more than a thin gray strip of afternoon light. I picked upstairs, not to win some point, not as a victory lap, but because, honestly, I just wanted daylight. And after 8 months of one kind of darkness or another, that felt like a reasonable, uncomplicated thing to finally ask for and actually receive. Dean, sometime after, sat with me on the back porch one evening while Vanessa was out running errands, and admitted, quietly, that he should have spoken up for me, should have been the one to say something the moment Vanessa relegated me to the basement on that very first afternoon, instead of standing there, uncomfortable and silent while it happened anyway. I told him I understood. We all collude with other people's small injustices sometimes, I said, because calling them out in the moment feels harder, somehow, than simply absorbing them and hoping the discomfort passes on its own. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when somebody's just described something true about yourself that you'd rather not have had named out loud, and we sat there for a while longer without saying much else, which felt, honestly, like its own small kind of repair. I noticed other things shift too. Smaller things, the kind that don't make for dramatic storytelling but matter more, day to day, than any single big conversation does. Vanessa started actually asking my opinion on things, what I thought about a paint color for the kitchen, whether I wanted to come along to a family event instead of being informed about it after the fact. She started including me, unprompted, in the planning for my granddaughter's next school event, made sure I had the date weeks in advance this time. It wasn't effusive or overcorrected, no sudden flood of attention clearly performed to make up for months of neglect. It was just steadier, more consistent, the ordinary baseline of consideration that probably should have existed from my very first afternoon in that house, finally arriving 8 months later than it should have. There was one evening, a few months after everything had settled into its new, steadier rhythm, when Vanessa knocked on my bedroom door, the upstairs one, with its actual window and its actual sunlight, and sat on the edge of my bed for a while, not saying much at first, just sitting. Eventually she told me, a little haltingly, that she'd thought about that first afternoon a lot since everything came out, replayed it in her head more times than she wanted to admit, and that she genuinely hadn't thought of it, at the time, as cruelty, just convenience. The basement being empty and available and requiring the least amount of effort to prepare. She said, realizing afterward how that convenience had actually landed on the other end of it, on me, had been harder to sit with than she expected. I told her I appreciated her saying so, and I meant it, even though it didn't erase 8 months of boxes stacked against my dresser. Some apologies don't need to erase anything to still matter. So yes, I signed the paperwork for the refinance, not as a prize to be won or a threat taken back, but because helping my son was the point all along, underneath everything else that had happened along the way. I'd never actually wanted to hold that lien over anyone's head as leverage. I'd simply needed, finally, for somebody in that house to understand what it actually was, and once that understanding existed honestly between all of us, signing felt like the natural, uncomplicated next step rather than some grand, magnanimous gesture I was making despite everything. These days, I wake up in a sunlit room upstairs, not a musty basement, the window actually large enough to watch the seasons change in the backyard below, something I genuinely missed during those first 8 months without quite letting myself admit how much. I'm included in family conversations now, asked rather than informed, consulted rather than managed around. And every time I feel a flicker of old anger about how things started, that first afternoon, the suitcases, the smirk, the narrow staircase, I remind myself of something that's taken me the better part of a year to fully accept. Respect didn't arrive after I pleaded for it or argued my case. Didn't arrive because I demanded it or staged some dramatic confrontation to force the issue. It walked in quietly in the form of an old lien, just paperwork everyone had conveniently ignored for 11 years. Until, at exactly the right moment, with the refinance stalled and the truth finally unavoidable, it simply couldn't be ignored any longer, and everything underneath it, every small unspoken injustice that had been allowed to settle in quietly alongside it, finally had no choice but to come up into the light along with it.